So ladies and gentlemen, I trust that everyone is well. I can see participants are logging in. We're already at 250. I believe it's going to be an exciting evening for all of us. And maybe as we wait for others to keep joining us, I will quickly, first of all, welcome everyone this evening to the discussion tonight. I'm sure it's going to be exciting as we talk as healthcare workers. I know a number of us would have received the vaccine by now, but we also know very well that there are still some of us who are still a bit afraid for different reasons. And that's the reason why we chose the topic for today. That well, we were at one point last year when we were very worried about COVID. We all kept hoping that the vaccine will come, and we wondered how long that was going to take. And then finally, the vaccine happened, and it was out there, and now it's here with us. But interestingly, despite waiting for it so much, once it arrived, we started developing second thoughts about it. And then this has been evidenced by what healthcare workers have been saying on the social media, and even queues not being as long as we'd have expected them to be. And the reason why we are having this discussion tonight is to ensure that at the end of the day, we don't let go of what we really wished for. And if there are any questions, they are answered so that we can remain comfortable. So before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind those who are joining us for the first time that these webinars have really been, the focus have been mental health. And the aim of these webinars really have been to support ourselves as healthcare workers, because for the longest time, we've been supporting people, and sometimes even the healer need healing. And that's the reason why this was started. And often we have a group of people who are panelists. And tonight we have Josephine Ohas, who is the physician wellness convener of the Kenya Medical Association. And Ohas, you want to say hi as we start off?
Thank you, Koba. Thank you to our speaker today, Dr. Vincent. Thank you to members of KMA, of CPAC, of NNK, of our clinical officers, and of course to the participants. I think we are all aware about what has been going on. We had launched the vaccine about two weeks ago, or is it 3? We know we have so many questions, and I think this is the right forum. We are blessed to have Daktari with us today to walk us through this very important topic. And I thank you all for taking the time to come and be with us as we learn about this vaccine that is very important for us as healthcare workers. So asante sana, Koba, asante sana to all of you. Karibuni sana.
Thank you very much. And we also have Joseph Chebi. Chebi, you want to say hi for a second?
Yeah, hi everyone. This is Joseph Chebi, Secretary General Kenya Clinical Officers Association. We are eagerly waiting to hear the presentation from Dr. Vincent so that we can allay anxieties that have been developed by our healthcare workers. Thank you so much and welcome everyone for this session. Asanteni.
Thank you. And another organization that's well represented. So we have clinical officer, we have Kenya Medical Association, we have the Clinical Psychologists Association. Liz.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this very, very important webinar. As Dr. Koba said, we have really been waiting for this vaccine. And now that it's here, there is a lot of anxiety, which actually is quite normal because of it's an unknown. But once we hear more about it from Dr. Vincent, I'm sure we will feel a bit more comfortable and we can be able to even talk to the other anti-vaxxers to come on board and take the vaccine. Karibuni sana, and we hope to enjoy this. Dr. Koba.
Thank you very much, Liz. And we have many other panelists that we'll be listening to along as we start our discussions, including our Secretary General, Kenya Medical Association. I can see Dr. Somba has joined. So without further ado, and in the interest of time, because I can see we have quite a number of participants, and I'm sure the reason why this discussion has had a lot of interest is because of what is currently going on. I would like to welcome our presenter. Our presenter is Dr. Vincent Muturi Kioi. He happened to have been my classmate in undergraduate, but since then he's moved on and gained many caps. And one of the things that he does is that he's the medical director at the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. So he's worked with many vaccines. So this is not an area that's new to him. And he'll be helping us think about why we are hesitating and demystify some of the myths. And I'm sure as he starts, he will be telling us that it's not the first time that we are worried about vaccine. I'm sure many of us would know that there are women who've had to be arrested because they belong to a certain religion and they were not willing to have their children given polio, for example, or even tetanus. And even when the HPV vaccine came, there was a concern about the young girls. So I'm not sure it's a very new area, but because it's affecting us, most of the time it's been about them, those children. But today it's about us. So I want to invite Dr. Vincent. Karibu sana, Dr. Vincent. We are eagerly waiting to hear from you. And as you all know, we may not allow you to unmute yourself to speak. However, please feel free to interact with us at the Q&A. Mostly ask questions at the Q&A to make it easy. But for any other comments, you can put them on the chat box and we'll be reading them as we go along. Thank you very much. Dr. Vincent, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koba, and thank you to KMA for the invitation today. For my disclosures, as Dr. Koba has said, I'm a full-time employee of IAVI, which is a non-profit organization focused on vaccine development for HIV and TB and other diseases. I have no links to the manufacturers of the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Serum Institute manufactured vaccine. And although I have a background in working for industry, I am speaking today in my capacity as a Kenyan healthcare worker. So this is the outline of my talk. I'll be looking at the burden of disease from COVID-19, something I think everyone here is familiar with, and giving input on what I believe is the case for use of vaccines to end this pandemic. I'll talk about the vaccine development process, as well as give a brief overview of the currently available vaccines against SARS-CoV-2. We are aware in Kenya, we only have one particular brand that's been made available, but there are a few others that are available in other countries around the world, so I'll touch on that a bit. I'll focus on the ChAdOx1 vaccine that's being used in Kenya and talk about the process for generating safety and efficacy results, and talk about a few of the safety signals that have been seen after approval of the vaccine. So the purpose of this talk, when I was invited, I was told, we want to try and address some of the issues around hesitancy. So in discussing all these points, I'll be pointing out, what is the background information to sort of allay some of the fears that have been raised concerning how fast the vaccines have been developed, in what way do they work, are they capable of affecting an individual's genetics, and what is the actual safety in terms of side effects that we know, and what are possible unknowns that we need to think about. So a brief background on coronaviruses. Coronaviruses are a large family of viruses that we've known about now for several decades. There are 7 types that infect humans, and 4 of these cause the common cold that we deal with all the time. Over the past 20 years, we've seen emergence of various forms of new coronaviruses that are capable of causing severe disease. So in 2002, 2003, we saw the first SARS coronavirus vaccine cause outbreaks in China and Canada. That particular virus was quite deadly in terms of the fact that it caused about 10% of those who were infected and got sick to die. So it had quite severe outcomes. But we did not see it spread across the world as we have with the current virus, because it wasn't as transmissible as what we are seeing now with the new strain of SARS-CoV-2. About nearly 10 years ago, we saw the emergence of a different beta coronavirus known as the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus. This caused outbreaks in Saudi Arabia and was associated with close contact with camels. That had a much higher case fatality rate, killing more than a third of those who were infected and got sick. But similar to the first SARS, was not easily transmitted between humans. And so the outbreak was contained quite quickly. The reason I bring up these two events is to point out that we have been thinking as a scientific community, a global scientific community, that it's possible for a coronavirus to eventually emerge and cause a global pandemic. And a lot of the measures that have gone into pandemic preparedness over the past 10 years or so, including a more focused efforts over the past 5 years, led by the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, have really put a lot of thought and effort into preparing for a pandemic that could possibly be caused by a new coronavirus, as we are seeing now. So these are figures that many of you will be familiar with. Looking at the Worldometer sites today, we have seen over 124 million cases have been reported around the world. In the past 1 year or so, we've seen more than 2.7 million deaths resulting from COVID-19, and 100 million individuals who are reported to have recovered. What these figures tell us is that although we've seen a large number of deaths worldwide and a huge impact of this infection on our way of life as a whole, there still remains a huge proportion of the human race that's susceptible to this virus. And with these figures, which if you look at the deaths caused by other infectious diseases over the past year, you'll see that the number of deaths caused by SARS-CoV-2 in the past 12 months even exceed what we see with TB, which causes an unacceptably high number of deaths. These figures point towards the need to intervene and try and end this pandemic. Over the past 12 months, we've seen more than 40 vaccines go into clinical evaluation for possible licensure to address this disease burden. And more than 11 of them are now in advanced stages of development. As of this month, we have about 7 vaccines that have been made available for public use in different countries. And as of last week, more than 400 million doses had been administered in 132 countries. And when we look at the vaccines that have been made available, you see that they're the mRNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna in the US, including the viral vector vaccines from companies like AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, and Gamaleya from Russia. In addition to that, you have vaccines from China that have been developed using technologies to inactivate the virus as well as viral vectors to use for delivery of the vaccine. What you will note is that compared to our initial expectation, I'll take you back to a year ago in March 2020, when we started seeing a profile of what would be an ideal vaccine to intervene against this epidemic. And we, at that time, had said that a vaccine with an efficacy of about 50% would still work to help with bringing down the rates of infection and addressing the public health need. What we've seen over the past 12 months is that the vaccines that have been developed have had efficacy rates exceeding 70%, and in some cases above 90%. What I would point out is that the efficacy that has been reported for a majority of these vaccines have been based on demonstration of prevention of symptomatic SARS-CoV-2 infection, so symptomatic COVID-19. When you actually look into the data and see how these vaccines have performed against severe disease that would result in hospitalization, the need for an ICU, or even death, the efficacy is much higher, approaching 100% for the majority of them. For the vaccine developed by the University of Oxford that is marketed by AstraZeneca and is made available to us by the Serum Institute, it requires a 2-dose regimen. And one thing that you will note is that the storage temperatures are between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius, which fits in very well with the infrastructure we have in this country for delivering vaccines. And this is true for many countries in our region. And that makes it appropriate for delivery within our setting. And when looking at the safety and efficacy profile, which I will come to in a few slides, you'll note that it actually does address our needs while also fulfilling the need to be safe while we prevent the infection. So this is a world map of vaccine uptake around the world. So as of this week, it's estimated that on a daily basis, more than 2.5 million vaccines are being administered around the world. Although we have seen several countries in our region take up the vaccine and have it distributed, thanks to global health mechanisms that have provided financing, as well as the work by governments to ensure that the vaccine can get approval for use in the country and providing the infrastructure for its delivery, we are still way behind many countries around the world. So less than 2 doses of the vaccine have been administered for every 100 members of our population. And I'm basically highlighting the fact that we have a very long way to go before we reach a threshold where we can say we have vaccinated enough people where we expect to see an impact on the burden of disease or transmission of infection. So coming to the vaccine development process, one of the main concerns that I've had and has been highlighted by many individuals who have expressed hesitancy at receiving this vaccine is that it was done too fast. How could we have a vaccine available less than a year after the virus strain was first isolated and sequenced? So on the left of your screen, on the blue bar, you see what we usually have with development of vaccines. So the different stages as well as the timeline. And an optimistic timeline for development of a vaccine from the time of preclinical analysis to manufacturing beginning is usually about 10 years. So this means that if you see the HPV vaccine becoming available in 2008, then the process for developing that vaccine may have started 10 to 15 years before that date. What you see on the right is the timeline that's been associated with the COVID-19 vaccines that I spoke about earlier. And it's actually been much faster because this initial estimate was that it would take us nearly 2 years for it to be distributed around the world. How has this been done? So as I said earlier, we already had measures in place for pandemic preparedness. There were various groups that had already tested their platforms for mRNA delivery as well as viral vector delivery of with vaccines against the previous versions of coronavirus that are causing serious disease in humans. Those platforms.
Vincent,
Yeah.
allow me 1 minute. There's a concern that your volume is very low. So maybe if you could get closer to your mic or something, then we can get better volume. Thank you for the comments for those who have shared with us. And maybe you can just adjust your volume, then you keep going.
Can you hear me? Is that better?
Yes, I think keep going. We'll let you know. We alert you.
Yeah, that's better.
All right, thank you. And thank you for letting me know. So if you look at the column on the right, the timeline that has been seen with the COVID-19 vaccines has been aided by the fact that a lot of work in discovery and preclinical testing of vaccines against previous forms of coronavirus that cause severe disease in humans allowed for a very quick move towards the clinic. So the preclinical analysis was much shorter for these current vaccines. We also had overlapping stages of development. Rather than going through phase 1 and waiting for results and reviews by regulatory authorities before going into later stages, we had overlapping phase 1, 2, and 3 studies that allowed for a much faster review of safety and efficacy data that was being produced from those who are being tested. When you look at the numbers for we have for vaccines that are typically submitted for licensure, by the time they've gone through phase 3 testing, you have tens of thousands of individuals that have received the vaccines. And this was the same case for the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines that we are seeing in use now. In addition to that, a lot of the companies chose to start the manufacturing processes at risk even before the results became available. And this allowed for availability for distribution very shortly after the review by regulatory authorities. When looking at what we have seen with the ChAdOx1 and COVID-19 vaccine from the University of Oxford, excuse me, this vaccine consists of what we call a non-replicating chimpanzee adenovirus. What this means is that the scientists who developed this vaccine took an harmless adenovirus, which mainly infects chimpanzees, and modified it to be able to insert a segment of the genetic material from the virus that we are fighting against. This allows administration of this vaccine into humans, and the virus that does not cause disease, nor does it replicate in our cells, is able to enter host cells and allow for use of our own cell machinery to produce the proteins of SARS-CoV-2. This then allows our own immune system to develop a response to those proteins without the possibility of the vaccine causing the disease we are trying to prevent. The trials for this vaccine have been carried out in the UK, Brazil, South Africa, and Kenya initially, with separate trials carried out in the Americas, in the USA, Chile, and Peru. When looking at the 4 trials that have provided data for the emergency use of this vaccine, basically the trials that allowed for us to receive it so early after the initial development was started, you'll notice several things. Number one, many of these trials were overlapping, as I've said. So the phase 1/2 trial in the UK was carried out in 1,000 participants, after which phase 2/3 trials were carried out in the same country once safety data was available. Overall, there were more than 23,000 individuals who were involved in these trials. And in this trial, you had the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine candidate tested against a meningococcal conjugate vaccine, which we are sure does not prevent or affect the course of illness of SARS-CoV-2. There were several issues that were highlighted as the results from these trials were being submitted, such as varying intervals between doses and the fact that for some participants, they received the wrong doses of the vaccine initially. So you had some individuals receive a low dose as the first dose, and this was accidentally. But overall, these trials provided enough data for us to make a decision on whether the vaccines could be used or not. Some of the procedures that were important to inform the efficacy and safety of these vaccines included the fact that for those who were enrolled, they were advised about reporting symptoms of possible SARS-CoV-2 infections. And once they reported symptoms, then they would be tested for virus infection. There were varying profiles of the symptom list that were given in UK and Brazil versus South Africa, but overall, the sensitivity to capture symptomatic COVID-19 was quite high. In addition to that, in the UK especially, individuals were provided swabs to be able to collect samples for themselves to test for asymptomatic infections. When talking about the outcomes, the data was pooled from all 4 studies, that being the 2 trials in the UK, as well as the trial in Brazil and the trial in South Africa. At the time when the submission was made, data was not yet available from Kenya, as the trial had just begun, and so it wasn't used to inform the emergency use approval. And so, very briefly on the results that were brought out, the overall vaccine efficacy was over 70.4%. And as I've said, the initial hope was that we'd get a vaccine which had an efficacy of at least 50% to be able to have a public health impact. There were cases where the efficacy was seen to be as high as 90% for individuals who received different doses at the 2 time points, so a low dose followed by the standard dose. However, when you look at the overall profile of the vaccine, we do believe that the 70% endpoint, based on the time point when these vaccines were being administered and the rate of infections during that period of the epidemic, that this 70.4 is really an appropriate reference point. So going over to the safety results, overall, the vaccine was considered safe based on the data from the 4 studies. And what this means is, when you look at the safety profile and balance it against the disease we are trying to prevent, the benefits of vaccination at a population level outweigh the risks of vaccination, of administration of the vaccine. When you ask the question, well, how much safety did they actually collect? I've already highlighted the fact that more than 26,000 individuals were included in the 4 trials. More than 23,000 individuals were included in the 4 trials. And when you look at how much data is available, this translates to more than 74,000 person months of safety follow-up. And what this means, a person month would be, if you followed 1 person for 1 month, that would be 1 person month. So we do have quite a robust set of safety data. When looking at the events that were reported, the events that we are sure are associated with vaccination include what was solicited and expected at the time of the start of the trials. So there were frequent cases of local pain, tenderness, swelling, change of color at the injection site for many. You also had constitutional symptoms such as fevers, muscle pains, lethargy, and all these were expected and were seen in quite a large proportion of participants. The majority of those events were mild to moderate in severity and resolved within the first 48 hours after vaccination. When looking at the severe events, and in this case, the serious adverse events were being defined as those resulting in hospitalization or resulting in serious outcomes such as death or that have been deemed to be life-threatening. There were a total of 175 of these in 168 participants, and these were equally distributed between those who received the COVID vaccine and those who received the control vaccine. Many of you may have heard last year in the press time points when this study was paused because of a serious event that was deemed to be possibly related to vaccination. So at that time, there was 1 case of transverse myelitis occurring 14 days after the booster dose of the vaccine was given, an independent neurological committee was convened to consider the most likely diagnosis. And at that time, they highlighted the fact that it was most likely to be an idiopathic short segment spinal cord demyelination, and did not make an association with the use of the vaccine. There were 2 additional cases of transverse myelitis. One of these occurred 10 days after the first vaccination. And when further investigation was done, the individual was found to have a pre-existing condition. And the second occurred more than 2 months after the vaccine was administered. And although it was initially considered to be possibly related, after the unblinding was done, it was found that this individual had received the control vaccine. There were 4 non-COVID deaths which occurred during the trial, which included road traffic accidents, other forms of trauma, and a fungal pneumonia, none of which were thought to be associated with use of the vaccine. 1 case of high-grade fever of 40 degrees Celsius was noted 2 days after vaccination in South Africa. This was associated with the use of the vaccine, but for that individual, they recovered rapidly after they were hospitalized and received treatment for that. I say all this to highlight the fact that even with the occurrence of some of these serious or severe reactions or serious events, there was no association that affected the benefit versus risk assessment for use of the vaccine, and this justified the rollout at a population level. So what have we seen after approval of the vaccines? What has been reported in the past few weeks was pausing of vaccination programs across Europe because of cases of blood clots that were thought to be associated with use of the vaccine. And when looking at the data that's actually been reported, these are 37 cases of individuals who suffered pathological conditions associated with blood clots, some of which included cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. The European Medicines Agency, which is the regulatory authority overseeing the use of the vaccine in Europe and that has granted the emergency use approval, convened what they call the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee. Now, the job of this group is to look at all the events and try and assess, is there a biological association between use of the vaccine and occurrence of these events? Secondly, they would also be trying to see if there is a change in the background rate in the events of interest, to see if the vaccines are causing a spike in the number of cases that would be expected had there been no vaccination program. And lastly, they also will be required to assess, is there a change in the benefit risk assessment for use of the vaccine? The investigations into these cases are still ongoing. And so some of you may have seen in the press this week that there are German scientists who are pointing towards a biological plausibility of association with use of the vaccine. However, the EMA and their Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee has assessed that in a situation where 37 cases have been noted across Europe, where more than 17 million doses of the vaccine have been used, and they're still seeing upwards of 2,000 deaths a day, the benefits of using the vaccine far outweigh the risks associated with the use of the vaccine, and therefore recommending continued use in the vaccination programs. The last bit of information I'd like to point out is with regard to the new circulating variants. And one of the concerns has been with mutation of SARS-CoV-2 and new variants becoming widespread, are we going to see a drop in the effectiveness or the efficacy of the vaccine? And is it worthwhile to still use this vaccine in spite of that? I'll take you back to the beginning where I stated that when it comes to the disease endpoint of interest, severe disease that results in hospitalization, a need for an ICU, or even death, the vaccine efficacy has been noted to be quite high. And for this vaccine, it's approaching 100%. When they tested for the efficacy of this vaccine against mild to moderate disease caused by the South African variant, Shabir Mahdi and colleagues last week reported that they did not note any efficacy against mild to moderate disease. So although this is a concerning finding, we still need to see what their findings would be when looking at an endpoint of severe disease that results in either hospitalization, ICU care, and need for ventilation or death. In spite of these results, we are still in a position where use of the vaccine would be recommended, because at the moment, we do believe that we should still see efficacy endpoints against severe disease, even with use of this vaccine in the face of new circulating variants. So I'll just stop there. I think that's my last slide. We have noted since yesterday that AstraZeneca has talked about results from the US trials. I didn't present those here, but the preliminary press releases that they provided seem to support continued use of the vaccine with 100% efficacy against severe disease. And so I think we do have a strong case for continued use of these vaccines. So I'll hand it back to you, Edith. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. You'll agree with me, as much as someone was asking why we are having this background, it actually is very helpful to understand, because while we are observing hesitancies, because we have very many questions that have not been answered, and I want to thank you for beginning to answer these questions. And so for you who was concerned about that, please just sit back and we are beginning to actually answer those questions. So I just want to first start one of the questions that really jazzed me. I saw it here, and they're asking, so amazing that COVID-19 vaccine was developed in a few months. How come HIV, which has been here for us for years, we haven't managed to do the same? What is so special about COVID-19?
So thanks, Edith. And as someone who works in the HIV vaccine development space, I think it's one of those questions that we receive all the time. The HIV virus is much more difficult to develop vaccines against because it is a highly variable pathogen. The targets that have been used in the past to try and create an immune response that would work against HIV have not worked, because every time you get an immune response, the virus mutates within the individual and is able to escape from that particular immune response. That challenge has been ongoing for the past 30 years, and we've seen a lot of progress in the right direction. We believe we now know what we should be doing and sort of have an endpoint in mind that would allow us to develop an effective immune response. But for HIV, we are still 10 to 15 years possibly away from an effective vaccine. I will say that the technological developments that were being applied to try and develop a vaccine against HIV were of great benefit to the development of vaccines against COVID. So all these platforms that have been successful for COVID had already been in development for HIV, and therefore were part of the benefits of accelerating the process for developing vaccines against SARS-CoV-2.
Thank you very much. And maybe someone was asking, why do you think Kenyans are hesitating? Are they just being paranoid? Or is there something that we don't know that is making, especially even healthcare workers, even very educated people, just hesitating? Why do you think this is happening, Dr.?
Well, when speaking about vaccine hesitancy, this is not unique to Kenyans, and this is also not unique to the current situation with the pandemic. Vaccine hesitancy has existed since the first vaccines were made widely available, and we started seeing vaccine mandates being rolled out across the world. So even in the 1800s, where mandates were given for use of the smallpox vaccine, in countries like Brazil, there were riots for people saying we don't want the vaccine. And I think it's really related to the type of information that's provided, as well as awareness about the burden of disease that's present. I think as long as we are able to communicate that the appropriate tests have been done to determine the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, then we should be able to address individual concerns that breed this hesitancy.
Thank you. So we have very many questions, so we'll just make it just brief. There's a question on liability. Is it true, for someone is asking, is it true that AstraZeneca had the liability waived? And if so, what happens if we discovered a few years from now that actually they didn't follow the right procedure and that we are suffering? What is the recourse?
So I would say that that is a question that's more appropriately put to the head of the vaccination program in Kenya or individuals responsible for the rollout. What we are aware of in the public space is that there's no individual company that gets a blanket waiver of liability. When using vaccines in vaccination programs, and this is true also for the ones we use in the EPI, we are aware that there are risks to individuals that will probably affect a few individuals, whereas the whole community benefits from use of these vaccines. And in managing a program, that is the responsibility of the government to ensure that they can address individual risks while allowing for the whole community to benefit.
Wow, thank you. That's what they call the public health perspective. I'm inviting Kigondu to ask the initial questions that were on the Q&A. And I think that's a very important point that unfortunately, even good things, and this is a point I keep telling my patients, paracetamol, for example, would cause liver failure. Fact, and it was tested, and that's one of the adverse effects. However, we keep using it. Why do we use it when we can read in the insert that it can cause liver failure? I think that would be the same information that we should have, especially as healthcare workers. And the truth is, there's no medication that's 100% safe. And unfortunately, even when we know paracetamol, for example, would cause liver failure on some patients, we continue to use because safety for the majority, the public health perspective, as you would put it. Kigondu, there were the initial questions in the Q&A. I invite you to say hi and please ask Dr. Vincent.
Thank you very much. I think we can continue. I've seen quite a number of questions. Why are expectant and breastfeeding mothers exempted from vaccination? That's a question relevant to me as a gynecologist.
Thanks, Dr. Kigondu. I think when it comes to expectant and breastfeeding mothers, if you look at the study designs that were used to develop the vaccines, they were not included in the groups that it was being tested in. And we generally wait to find out if it's safe in healthy adults and then those at greatest risk, and then start going into special groups like pregnant women and then children and adolescents. At the moment, there are plans to test it in pregnant women, but that data is not available. The current recommendation is that for those pregnant individuals who are at high risk of infection, and that includes healthcare workers, you would weigh the risk versus the benefit, and where the risk of the disease infection is high, then the recommendation is to vaccinate those individuals.
Purity Njeru asks, is there any risk in giving the vaccine to hypertensive patients?
So that's a very good question. And I think it's important to note that, especially for the US trials, they ensured that 60% of individuals who are enrolled had a pre-existing condition. And these included individuals with hypertension, as well as diabetes and other conditions. And the safety profile has been demonstrated in this group, so they should actually get vaccinated.
A common question, Cheriot Hilary asks, can the vaccine alter one's DNA?
Right. So I think this is a very commonly asked question, and I did address it during the presentation, but I'll reiterate, the vaccine cannot affect an individual's genetics in any way, nor can it affect individual DNA. The vaccine does not penetrate the cell nucleus. The production of the protein that we are interested in is in the cytoplasm, and therefore we are fully sure that it cannot affect an individual's DNA.
An anonymous attendee asks, I am allergic to chicken. For me.
To chicken? Right. So the only absolute contraindication is a severe allergic reaction to this vaccine. So if you get a severe allergic reaction after the first dose, then you cannot receive the second dose. If you have severe allergic reactions to other vaccines, it's important to try and explore which vaccines those are to see if the formulation is similar to this enough that you would be excluded from vaccination. When talking about general allergies, such as allergies to eggs, chicken, or any other product that's used or consumed commonly, those are not contraindications, and therefore those individuals can get vaccinated.
There are questions on the Sputnik vaccine. Any comment on that?
So the Sputnik V vaccine from Russia is also an adenovirus vector vaccine, and we've seen the Russians donate it to some countries, including a few countries in Africa. The difference in the development process with what we have in Kenya is that they actually rolled it out very early on. Once they got a safety signal, they rolled it out on a widespread basis, but they've been investigating the safety and effectiveness since then. It seems to work very well with a good efficacy rate, and so far we haven't seen any major safety issues.
Why focus on vaccines instead of a cure for COVID? A very good question.
When looking at the clinical development space, and I'd encourage everyone on the call to go onto the WHO website where they highlight all the different trials that are taking place.
Kitambaa ya black inakaa kama ilikuwa ile longi ya I think ilikuwa ya Audrey ya sweat ya velvet yenye tulikata.
Peter mute. Thanks.
Thank you. So when you look at the space of all the products in development, aside from vaccines, there are several drugs that are being tested in clinics around the world, including clinical trials taking place here in Kenya, to see whether there are products that can be used to treat or to cure the disease once it's taken effect. So that work is ongoing. We've seen positive results for dexamethasone that have supported its use on a widespread basis. We've seen other results for monoclonal antibody products that have supported their use. And I think this is an ongoing process. So it's not that we are saying vaccines only and no one should do any work on cure, but these are taking place in parallel.
I'm sure you covered this, but just for those who didn't hear, what is the difference between viral vector vaccine and the mRNA types vaccine?
Right. So for the viral vector vaccines, these use an artificial virus that's been modified in the lab so that it cannot replicate itself to deliver the genetic material of SARS-CoV-2 into an individual. And once these viruses enter the body, they enter the cell and release the genetic material into the cell where the normal ribosomes used are able to generate the proteins for SARS-CoV-2 in that space. For mRNA, a similar process takes place where small particles deliver the viral mRNA into our own cells, and then our cell machinery generates the proteins for the SARS-CoV-2. So they are similar in that space. Both of them only deliver gene segments, but one uses a vehicle, which is an artificial virus, and the other one uses a platform that directly delivers messenger RNA from SARS-CoV-2.
For the ChAdOx vaccine, how long will the viral DNA last in the human cell nuclei?
Right. So as I said earlier, the viral DNA does not enter our nucleus. what we see is production of the SARS-CoV-2 proteins in our cell cytoplasm, but we do not have the viral DNA or mRNA going into the nucleus. The artificial virus, that's the ChAdOx, which was developed by the Oxford team, that virus enters the cell but dies off on its own. And because it does not replicate, it does not last more than the lifespan of that individual virus.
Is it true that the vaccine should not be given to someone who has gotten the disease within 3 months?
Right. The current recommendation is around vaccination is that, number one, those individuals who have previously been infected with with SARS-CoV-2 and suffered COVID-19 should receive vaccination. Some data coming out of Europe last week did demonstrate that there are cases of reinfection following individuals suffering from the disease. So although many of them were able to be protected over an extended period of time of more than 6 months, for the elderly especially, this protection was very low at less than 40%. And it is recommended that for these purposes, individuals should be vaccinated. As far as how long after the infection should they receive the vaccine, I think the recommendations vary from place to place. What I would say is that as soon as an individual is eligible for vaccination and are asymptomatic, they should be vaccinated.
A related question from Francis Aboto and George Amemba. Why was the Oxford AstraZeneca chosen to be used in Kenya over the other vaccines, and what's its effectiveness? I'm sure it was covered a bit, but you can repeat. And the other one in George asks, why the 2-dose instead of the 1-dose? And the 1-dose maybe cover a bigger population.
I think those are relevant questions. As far as the choice of vaccines, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that there are not very many choices out there. Although I did highlight there are several vaccines in use around the world, the number of doses that are actually available for countries around the world are not that many. The second thing is something I highlighted during the talk was that the cold chain requirements for the AstraZeneca vaccine, for which we are relying on the Serum Institute of India to provide us, these cold chain requirements fit in very well into our health system. Some of the other vaccines I highlighted require cold chain with temperature requirements of less than minus 20 degrees Celsius or minus 80 degrees Celsius, which unfortunately at this time we are not capable of using for widespread delivery. When thinking about the fact that this vaccine requires a 2-dose regimen, compared to the newly available Johnson & Johnson vaccine that requires a single dose, I think, number one, it goes back to capacity to supply the world. At the moment, we haven't seen the Johnson & Johnson vaccine being readily available for mass distribution around the world. And I'd like to finish by saying the vaccine that's available to us is the most appropriate vaccine. So and that's why we are using it, because it's effective, safe, and it is appropriate for our system.
Rose Sir Andras asks, what about sinus thrombosis and other vascular complications? I suppose this relates to the partial withdrawal stoppage.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I did highlight the fact that this is still something that regulators are looking into. However, at the moment, when you look at the number of cases that have been reported versus the benefits that could be accrued by use of the vaccine, the benefits still outweigh any risks that any potential risks that may exist.
An interesting question. With the antigen shift and drift that we see in most respiratory viruses, are we expecting that from COVID-19? And if so, will we see the modification of the current vaccine mutations that we might see in future?
And so that's a very good question. And when talking about antigen drift and antigen shift, this is something that's very commonly described for the flu viruses, for example, where antigen drift is the gradual change of the virus strain that's circulating, where it modifies the surface protein slightly over time. And this is what we've already seen with development of variants in South Africa, the UK, and some parts of the US. So we know that is something we will have to address over time. And although we are not sure whether we will need new vaccines in the near future, it is something that may require us to have boosted doses in the future that address this issue. When talking about antigen shift, that is more or less talking about a new virus altogether appearing. So we saw this with the H1N1 influenza virus in 2009, where a new virus strain emerged into the human population. So this is something that's possible, judging from the fact that we are now dealing with a new SARS-CoV-2 strain in the human population. And I think at that point, we would need to develop new vaccines against that new strain.
James Juma asks, how long does it take for the vaccine to be effective after injection? I guess this comes after the famous infection by governor. After.
So I won't comment on that, but with regard to when we expect protection to be in, at the moment we have a vaccine that protection was tested 3 weeks after the second dose was administered. When looking at the information of the immune responses, it would be safe to say that majority of people would have effective protection 2 weeks after the second dose is administered. I think the take-home message should be that everyone who's vaccinated should receive a full 2-dose regimen.
How do you explain the higher efficacy for those who received a lower prime vaccine dose compared to the boost dose? I suppose that comes from the presentation.
Right. So yes, they did note that for those who received a priming dose, which was lower than the second dose, and as I said, this happened accidentally, the efficacy in those individuals was closer to 90%, whereas the overall efficacy was about 70%. The full explanation is not yet known. What I would say is that this has been seen with other vaccines against meningococcal disease in children. We've seen it for a malaria vaccine candidate as well. And this issue of fractional dosing with high immune responses has been seen as well with yellow fever vaccines. At the moment, there are immunological explanations that could point towards a possible reason for this, but I wouldn't go into that at this time.
Martin Onga says, we are aware of the new variants that are fast spreading and purportedly more vicious than the earlier strain. What is your comment on the efficacy of the present vaccines being administered in the wake of the new strains? This question keeps coming up.
And I think it's an important question to ask. Should we use this vaccine in the wake of the new strains that are circulating? I think the point that Martin has highlighted, that many of these new strains are being associated with higher rates of severe disease, is a reason why we should be interested in vaccinating as many people as fast as possible. When talking about whether we have data on efficacy against the new strains, I highlighted the fact that specifically for the South African variant, when talking about mild to moderate disease, there was no efficacy noted with use of this vaccine. However, when we are waiting to see what the data will say about efficacy against severe disease. However, I do not think that at this stage we should be making decisions about halting our vaccination program because of fears of lack of efficacy against new strains.
A safety question is coming up many times. It seems there are so many vaccines from different places. Are they all safe? If not, How does a layman keep safe from the unsafe ones?
Right. And I think this is a very good question. What we should be aware of is that prior to development of the vaccine, what we call a target product profile was developed for what would be an ideal vaccine against COVID-19. When we have now about 4 vaccines that the WHO has said can be recommended for emergency use, their reference point is this safety profile. And the majority of vaccines which have been provided for emergency use do meet this safety profile, and therefore are in keeping with the expectations. And so to the question, I don't think there are any vaccines that will be approved for use in Kenya for which any individual needs to be concerned that they should run away from one and run towards another.
Kindly, is there any information on what would happen to one who gets the vaccine and are asymptomatic and unaware?
Right. And this is another common question in terms of, will the vaccine protect you from an infection that has already set in? For individuals who are already infected prior to vaccination, we do not expect the vaccines to protect them. That means that if you develop symptoms of COVID-19 after vaccination, so within the week after vaccination or within 2 weeks of the first dose, it is likely that you already had an infection that had set in prior to vaccination, and you should seek medical care for that infection and not hope that the vaccine would have any effect on the course of that illness.
In Kenya, has the country done enough clinical trials on the COVID vaccine?
I think we are in a very good space as Kenyans. Number one, I already highlighted that one of the clinical trial sites for this very vaccine is here in Kenya. And so for those who are concerned about, is there safety data that's relevant to our population, I think that will be answered by the data that will come out of the Kemri site that's conducting the trial. And secondly, when talking about do we have enough safety data for us as Kenyans to be confident in it, you have to look at the global picture of all the safety data that's been collected around the world. In the clinical trials, for the trials that went into the authorization for the current emergency use, those were 23,000 individuals. In the US, that was another 32,000 or so individuals. And since its emergency use authorization, we've seen more than 17 million people around the world receive the vaccine. And there is continuing systematic collection of safety information and analysis to see if the benefit risk profile is changing. And so we can be very confident in the use of this vaccine.
Joseph Chebi, I think is one of our panelists, asks, kindly say something about vaccination and COVID positive patients.
With regard to individuals who are COVID positive in the sense that they have an ongoing illness, for anyone who is symptomatic, they should not receive the vaccine. They should be referred for clinical care, and they should be managed clinically without use of the vaccine at that time point. For individuals who recover from COVID, they should be vaccinated after their recovery, because we do believe that especially those at highest risk of severe disease will benefit from immunization that would prevent future infections.
The safety clots question keeps coming up, and I've seen several. Hi, please clarify on the blood clot issue. If someone had open or closed surgery which had some blood clots recently, are they prone to negative effects? And also seen someone who has asked, if I had the DVT, do I get the vaccine?
So I think this question goes to what happens to individuals who already have conditions that predispose them to development of blood clots. And in that scenario, we are still recommending the use of the vaccine. At the moment, with the 37 cases that were reported to the European Medicines Agency, there has been no there's no pointer towards the fact that pre-existing conditions would allow for development of blood clots in individuals who are susceptible to that because of use of the vaccine.
Very good. Will we stop wearing masks after everyone has received the vaccine?
So I think that is something that the government that has mandated us to use masks will need to comment on. But I will point out that in countries where you have high uptake of the vaccine and large groups of people or large proportions of the population having been vaccinated, you're seeing those masks mandates being relaxed. So I think we saw from the US earlier this month, the recommendation that if a group of individuals who've all been vaccinated are meeting together, then there's no need for use of masks. I think each individual country and each individual government will need to make decisions based on their own situation. But I do believe that the vaccine will have an effect on the public health measures and recommendations going forward. At the moment, nothing has changed. So even all the healthcare workers who have received the vaccine should continue to use masks even after they've received their second dose, because as I said, there is a chance you could be infected and you end up with an asymptomatic infection. And we don't want a situation where, because people feel they are safe, they end up transmitting virus to individuals who might be susceptible.
Does the vaccine offer lifelong protection? If not, how frequently will we get vaccinated?
So the answer to that question is we do not know at this time. As I said, it's been a year since this disease, or since this infection was declared to have caused a pandemic. And it's been just a few months since widespread use of the vaccines was put in place. We will need to follow up people over a long period of time to determine how long the immune response lasts and how long protection lasts.
Benedict Maungu asks, could you explain the reported hesitancy among healthcare workers? Since we assume healthcare workers are well informed, do you foresee wastage as a possible scenario?
I wouldn't say that I foresee wastage as a scenario because of the hesitancy among healthcare workers. I would say that hesitancy among healthcare workers is a concern that we need to continually address. Healthcare workers are our advocates for uptake of the vaccine within the community. And I think, programs like what KMA is doing today should be encouraged to try and build confidence in use of the vaccine among healthcare workers, which we hope would translate in more confidence within the general community.
Kokonya asks whether our doctors, universities are in the process of developing a vaccine. And if so, how far are they? And if not, why?
I can't speak to the position on vaccine development in our local institutions. I will say that there are several institutions, including KEMRI and several universities in this country that are involved in the development process, from the basic science to the clinical testing. And so we shouldn't see vaccines coming from outside and think, oh, we have no part to play in that. There are several local institutions that participate in the process that make it possible for these vaccines to be available worldwide.
So at this point, I think, Vincent, you've talked a lot, and I want to give you a breather and allow some of the other panelists to have sort of a last sort of comment on this vaccine issue. I've seen a lot of the panelists who are very interested in vaccines and vaccine hesitancy. And at this point, I would hand over back to Dr. Kwoba to maybe invite some of, I've seen prominent panelists who can make a comment on the issue. Thank you very much, Dr. Vincent.
Thank you very much, Kigondu. You've done a very, very good job in addressing that initial bit. There are very many questions, and it's true. I have seen Professor Lukoya at Wally is around. I hope, Prof, you were able to speak. And one of the things I'd like to ask Wally regarding the hesitancy, is it related in any way to the mental health status of the people of Kenya? I don't know whether or is it what? Is it just a normal reaction to an unusual circumstance? Professor Lukoya Wally.
Yeah, thank you very much, Edith. There are many reasons why people do things. And of course, as we know in mental health, the determinants are multiple. For the purpose of vaccine acceptance and vaccine hesitancy, the social component plays a bigger role than what is happening inside your own mind. So if you're in a community of people who have a certain attitude towards vaccines and you're a member of that community, then you're less likely to be accepting of an initiative like this than somebody who is in a community that is more accepting. Secondly, the personality types that people have. People have different personalities, and there are people who are ready to experience new things, and they'll be more likely to accept an initiative like this. And there are people who are very resistant to new things, so they're less likely to accept. They will be the late adopters compared to those who try things in the beginning. And so any messaging, any program must take into account that the population will have this variety of people, and therefore whatever intervention we are making and whatever consultations we do, we have to take into consideration all these different types of people. Now, if somebody has a mental illness, as you know, depending on the severity of the illness, and their capacity to consent is also impaired, and that can also be a factor that will determine whether people will accept to be vaccinated or not, or indeed whether somebody else should make that decision for them, especially because of their vulnerability. People with mental illness in the context of COVID-19 are highly vulnerable. And when we start looking at vaccinating people who are vulnerable, we need to think about prioritizing also people with severe mental illness because of their condition. So there are interactions indeed between mental health and physical health on the one hand, and mental health and the interventions for physical health, including vaccination, as we have seen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Lukoya. And that's very well elaborated. And I agree with you that even people with mental illness, especially ones who work in the wards, they can't even wear masks, for example. So even the very basic following the instructions to protect themselves is very difficult. I see Joy Mugambi is around with us, and she's a family physician. And one of the things that, when someone was asking about the rumors, and it's true on the ground, there's a lot of rumors. Joy Mugambi, how do you propose that we should go ahead and somehow take care of the rumors? Because I think Vincent has done a very good job by telling us some of the people who are said to have died even died of road traffic accidents. And yet, unfortunately, like in the social media, there's this discussion of how people are dying. We know that many people have probably risk of DVT and other reasons why they could develop a clot. But here we are, and the society saying, no, you wait, someone collapsed after developing a clot. How would we go about it, especially as healthcare workers, to dispel these fears and rumors, especially because, like Vincent said, if we as healthcare workers don't believe vaccines work, it's unlikely that my mother will believe it. How can we go about it, Joy?
Thank you very much, Edith. I truly appreciate that question, and thank you very much, Vincent, for that very clear, articulate presentation, because it has highlighted a lot of key things, and I really have enjoyed the way you've answered these questions, because one of the key things that we need to do to expel all these myths and misconceptions is the community gathering, the education that comes over to health workers, highlighting their concerns without just stating them, being able to educate them and give them information that they share down back to the community. The other thing is I'm really, really passionate about community engagement. We are about to roll out to the older persons, but we've not reached out to the people who talk to older persons and to the people who engage with the older person. These are religious leaders, elders, the local leaders of that region, and the local professionals. I work in a very rural place, and as much as things happen in Nairobi, sometimes you end up finding people telling you, after all, this illness is for Nairobi, this vaccine is for Nairobi, because the people who are vaccinated first are in Nairobi and the bigger cities. But there is need to surely engage the communities and their community leadership and the people that they trust most, which is also the health workers that are in those regions, in order for them to mitigate these issues that are brought about in terms of hesitance. I would proudly say the vaccination in my facility started yesterday. And as of now, we have almost covered half of our staff, and that is only in the last 24 hours. That tells you community engagement and sticking with your staff, educating them of what the vaccine is all about is really key. And leading by example, be the one taking the vaccine first, and then tell them that it is a safe process once you have the information. Thank you very much, Koba, and back to you.
Thank you. And one other thing that when you're talking that I remembered, every time a mother went to have the pentavalent or the other drugs, the mother would be told you can also have paracetamol after that. And we always found it okay for that mother to be told you can take paracetamol. Interestingly, it seems like it's not okay for someone to take paracetamol during this season when they have developed some side effect. Like, we are okay if a baby develops fever after a certain vaccination for them to give him paracetamol, but you want to make it look like it's very bad that people would actually need to take paracetamol. Vincent, I want to ask you, what do you propose, especially because we know that being the fact that the person has been given a vaccine, as a matter of fact, they likely will experience something. As a positive side, in my view, that their body is actually responding to that protein that was put in them. What should they do to especially make themselves comfortable? And are these some of these side effects that are being reported are really fatal?
Right. So for the majority of individuals, the most common side effects after vaccination will include the fever, malaise, muscle aches and pains, maybe joint pains as well as pain at the injection site. For the majority of those individuals, if they use paracetamol or over-the-counter pain medications, they should be able to recover within 24 to 48 hours and be completely asymptomatic. So that is the recommendation. If you develop symptoms, to use these over-the-counter medications to address those, and if they persist, then you probably need to see a physician. One thing I will add is for individuals who are considering taking paracetamol in advance, we've seen for some other vaccines that may interfere with the immune response, and so that is not recommended with this vaccine.
Thank you. And I see Catherine Mutisia is here with us. I hope she has her mic on. One of the things that happens in such situations, especially when you hear a lot of negative information, you can actually develop some anxiety. And so that some of these symptoms that people will experience are actually in their mind because they were told, because they had, because they read. And maybe Catherine Mutisia, you can help us learn how to manage those symptoms when you experience them. I used to hear it being called the third-year medical student syndrome, where after you know about some possible symptoms, then you begin to experience them. I don't know what you'd say about a person who is already experiencing, and I have had people experiencing chest pains, and we know that some of these chest pains may be real, but some might actually be in the mind because they're anxious. If one develops such symptoms because of anxiety, how should they handle them? Looks like Catherine may not be very near her mic. I don't know, Professor Lukoya Twoli, how should they handle that anxiety? Secondary. So I'm feeling chest pains, but this chest pain is not because I actually have chest problems, but because I read about it.
Yeah. So thank you. And in the context of COVID, somebody can get a vaccine and then when they sleep at night, they start feeling like they have a heavy chest, they have this itchy throat, they think now, or maybe they even get a fever and they say, now I have COVID. And so the first protection is to arm yourself with information. So it's good to know about COVID. It's good to know about the vaccination, good to know about the effects and side effects in advance, so that when you start experiencing them, then you are aware that some of these things I'm feeling are actually expected as part of what I am going through. So getting information, and what Vincent has done today is brilliant. It's given a lot of information. We need to do this more often and get people prepared like this. And then secondly, it's an individual to gauge themselves. So there are certain things that we do called relaxation exercises. If you start getting a bit short of breath, there are breathing exercises that people do in order to regain control over their emotions. Physical exercise helps, being healthy to begin with helps. But if at some point then you feel completely overwhelmed and you feel like this is not something you're in control of, it's okay to seek help from a health facility. And we have this hotline, I think you're going to flash that towards the end of this, where somebody can call and speak to a mental health expert who will work with them to determine whether what they're experiencing is something that has psychological origins, or if it is something that they need treatment for as a physical condition. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. I think as we all can see, we really are running out of time, and there are very, very many questions. And maybe as we finish, I'll ask Peter not to close the meeting before we can take all these questions and see how we can answer them, even if not on live right now. But maybe I'll ask Vincent, before he makes his closing remarks about the hesitancy and the side effects, to just speak to one issue that's very common on the questions about people who are immunocompromised, HIV, lupus, and any other problem that actually compromises their immunity. I feel like it's very common, and maybe it's good to reassure those people whether they should take that vaccine. Then you can make your closing remarks.
Thanks, Dr. Koba. With regard to individuals who are immunocompromised, and I think in our setting, we are talking about HIV positive individuals. On the one hand, there was great concern initially at the beginning of the pandemic about these individuals being at higher risk of severe disease and death due to COVID-19. What came to pass is that this didn't actually pan out, and we were quite happy to see that it did not increase the risk of severe disease for the majority, especially those who had good virological control. When it comes to the vaccination, the recommendation for use of the vaccine, all individuals who are HIV positive, as long as they do not have a symptomatic illness that would force you to postpone the vaccination, that means they do not present with a fever or any other signs or symptoms of illness, then those individuals should be able to receive the vaccine. For individuals who do present with symptoms of illness, they should be referred for care first prior to vaccination. What do we expect as far as the immune responses? At the moment, we do not have enough data to say whether they will achieve the same level of responses as otherwise healthy individuals, but that they should receive the vaccine nonetheless, because we do believe there will be protection from infection with SARS-CoV-2.
Thank you so much, Vincent. You'll agree with me, everyone, that there was no better person who would have broken down this as Vincent has done. We really appreciate. Of course, we mind that the most of the people listening here have families and other things to do this evening, and that's why we can't go on and on. But I hope that Vincent can, as he listens to these closing remarks, continue to answer the questions on the Q&A, especially the ones that are quick to answer, and anyone else who can give a quick response to some of those questions. But we really appreciate that the message is very clear. COVID-19 is here, and COVID-19 kills. Vaccines have existed to protect us, maybe not from getting infection. We know that even when you get BCG, you still might get your TB, for example. However, or when you get your measles vaccine, you get measles. But the thing is, it prevents you from dying. And I'm sure that most of the people seated here have a lot to do in life. We are not yet ready to die. And that is the reason. It makes sense then for you to do what is humanly possible. And one of the things that's humanly possible to protect yourself from dying from COVID is to take a vaccine. And as we talk, it's been, for me, at least more than 2 weeks. Actually, it's exactly 2 weeks. I happen to be one of the first people who are vaccinated with the CEO in MTRH. I'm still here and living and praying that I don't get any side effects, because the best thing to have done is to protect myself in addition to wearing masks. And we hope that we are convincing ourselves that, especially we frontliners who are continuously at risk, will do what is possible. Take the vaccine, protect yourself. I think it would be foolish for it to be said that Koba died of severe disease because she refused to take the vaccine. Even if there's a chance I could die, I think I'm safer taking the vaccine and getting protected. So I hope we are going to take it positively, and especially be the ambassadors of the vaccine, not because we've been paid by AstraZeneca. If you listen to Vincent, you might think that he's been employed, but remember what he said, he has never worked for AstraZeneca, he's not been paid. And that should be the spirit, that this is what we can do as human beings. So thank you so much for joining us. And I know one is wondering, how is this related to mental health? It's because when you're worried about this vaccine or whether you get COVID, then you're not mentally healthy. And by addressing the issues that are at hand, like the vaccine, then we hopefully are improving our mental wellness. I want to thank our panelists, everyone who has contributed. I want to thank especially Vincent. Really, it's been awesome, and we hope that you will continue engaging with us going forward. We'll see whether we'll need to come back later and continue discussions. We really appreciate. And just to keep reminding us, and as I say this, Peter, I hope you can put up the call center that I will invite Liz Gitao to talk about other things we're doing as KMA, but to keep reminding ourselves that we are here every Tuesday, and the aim is to make sure that we are having a conversation as healthcare workers, we for ourselves, to ensure that we are moving together, whatever things that are worrying us. Feel free to suggest to us whatever it is that you feel we can continue discussing to ensure that we are well, because we said we are the frontliners this season of COVID-19. We must ensure that no soldier is left behind, including by this ban of the COVID-19 vaccine. And Gondo would like to remind you that on Thursday, there will be another webinar. So other than this Tuesday evening, there's another webinar on Thursdays. So on Thursday at 2 p.m., please join Igondu and team to discuss about methadone clinic services during COVID-19 pandemic. Liz Gitao, I hope you're there to say a word or two and share something about the call center.
Thank you very much. Asante sana, Dr. Koba, for the lovely moderation. You've been an awesome host. Thank you also, Dr. Kioi, for the very lively presentation. We have learned a lot of myths have been demystified. The questions just kept on coming, and I do believe that we've had a good interactive sessions. For those of us whose questions were not answered, I'm sure Peter has collated them, and we shall be sending them to the various panelists so that we can have answers available on our various platforms, and also attached to this video so that you can have answers to your questions. We shall also be noting some of the topics that have come up so that they can form part of our next webinars. I would like to thank Dr. Ohas and her team, Koba, Liz Haemba, Dr. Catherine, Joy, for the lovely work they've done. Joseph Chebi, asante sana, and also to the NANAC team, thank you very much for always keeping these Tuesdays quite lovely, ensuring that we're always having presentations that are helpful for the mental health of our healthcare workers. So without further ado, is also to remind you that apart from the mental health webinars and the Thursday webinar that have been done about COVID-19 management, is that we have a dedicated call center for health workers, just for health workers and their families. And of course, it's open to us here who work still in the health sector and are not per se professional healthcare workers. You're free to call us. The number is right there. We have various numbers. I think the toll-free line has been removed from there. Sorry, I've seen it. 0800 720 608. That is our toll-free line. Please feel free to call us anytime during the day, at night. If you get any hang-up call, there's always someone to call you, and we are happy to give you free assistance. During this pandemic, apart from the COVID pandemic, in terms of getting sick, majority of the things that we are dealing with are actually based on mental health and emotional health. So this is a time, take advantage. we have had funding from the Equity Group Foundation and the Kenya COVID Fund to be able to ensure that we're having a call center for healthcare workers. Without further ado, Peter, you can put up the poster for Thursday. Thursday, again, I think it's these webinars have sort of interchanged this week. And for Thursday, we shall be doing something quite exciting regarding methadone-assisted treatment for patients who use heroin, and to see what has been happening during this COVID period in terms of how have we taken care of them, including also psychosocial support. So if you're interested in mental health, that's another very, very amazing webinar for you. Asante Koba, back to you.
Thank you very much. So I think we have come to the end. I know there are other people who would have given a chance, but I know, again, time is far spent. We really thank you. I think we can continue this conversation another time. Remember, your mental wellness is your business as well as our business as KMA and CPAC and all the organizations that are here. And remember that you need to remain well. You cannot talk health to anyone if yourself you're not healthy. So let's keep meeting here and ensuring that we remain healthy so that we can be able to talk health to other people. Thank you. Have a lovely evening. Peter, don't close the meeting yet so that we can see whether we can respond to questions out of this setting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for a wonderful day. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you for a good presentation. Good night.
Good night.